Today we're going to be animating a drop-down menu. And this drop-down menu right here was built with Radix. If you've never heard of it before, it's this really cool library that gives you a bunch of components like this that we can style any way we want. They're headless, and in this case we've styled it with Tailwind, and so it's wired up over here, and right now it works just like this. So what we want to do is animate this with Framer Motion so that, the menu doesn't just appear and disappear like that. We're going to add some cool animations inspired by the actual menu here from Mac OS. And so it's going to look more like this. It's going to have some fading, and we'll have this kind of selection behavior as well. So if we take a look at the code, we'll see we have our drop-down menu from Radix. We render a trigger, which is the button right here. It has a little Apple logo. And then we can render our content with our items. And right now, I just kind of extracted a simple item component where we render the drop-down menu.item. Again, this is all styled using Tailwind right now, but this is pretty basic, simple wiring up of this Radix menu. And to start animating this, let's start by working on the actual menu right here. So again, there's conceptually two animations we want to add. First, we want the menu to be able to fade in and fade out. So we want kind of mount and unmount animations for the actual menu. And then we want some animations once we select an item to highlight that before we run its action. And so the first thing we want to do is animate this menu, which currently right here is being rendered by this drop-down menu.content. We can see all these classes like background white, and that's what's controlling the overall menu. Now, these Radix components actually have a prop that make it super easy for us to kind of compose the Radix behavior with the animation behavior from Framer Motion, and that is called asChild. And so what this is going to do is going to forward all of the props and behavior from this component to a child element of our own. So if we were to save this and come over and look at our console and scroll to the top, you'll actually see React children only expected to receive a single React child. And so whenever you do this, we need there to be a single child here because what this is doing is forwarding all of this stuff to the first child element. And so we want to just have a div right here, and that should bring it back. And now we can turn this into a motion.div from Framer Motion. But if we inspect this menu, we're not going to see any new divs added at all. So this is really cool from just a composability standpoint. We kind of have all of our original structure here with the actual menu and all the items and the wrapper for the portal. But that's just kind of how this works, which means we can now say initial is opacity 0 and animate is opacity 1. And just like that, we have mount animation. So again, I was pretty impressed with this API. asChild, wrap our items in our own motion div. It kind of forwards all those props, puts it together, and now we can start going to town with Framer Motion. Okay, so we have our mount animation, but when we dismiss the menu, it just kind of disappears. And if we take another look at the Mac OS menu, we see when we click away from it, it kind of fades away, which is nice behavior that we want to go ahead and add to our demo here. And so the way we do this with Framer Motion is with animate presence and exit animation. So if you've used Framer Motion before, you know that we can add an exit prop to this. Let's just go ahead and fade it out for now, something like that. But for this to work, this needs to be conditionally rendered and it needs to be wrapped in an animate presence. So let's go ahead and wrap this whole thing in animate presence, just like that. And we'll go ahead and import this. And if we save this, you might expect this to work, but it's not actually going to. And that's because for animate presence to work, we actually need the conditional logic in the JSX underneath it. So that's kind of a little tip to remember when working with Framer Motion and animate presence. You always need the conditional to be in the template. And right now, these components are kind of wired up to implicitly render or not render the contents based on whether the menu is open. That's one of the benefits of this library, right? It's doing all this implicit wiring for us. But as we're about to see, if we need more control because we want to control rendering ourselves to be able to integrate with a library like this, we're able to. And so what we need is some way to basically say open If open is true, then we want to render all of this stuff. This is kind of the idea. And this is exactly how Framer Motion is able to make exit animations work. But how can we do this? Well, first of all, we need this menu to not show and hide by itself. We want it always to be shown and then for it to be controlled with this variable of our own. And a lot of these Radix components have a prop called force mount. And look at that. Force mount is going to make sure the menu is always rendered. Right there on reload, we're seeing the mount animation run. But even if we were to kind of try to show or hide the menu, it's always rendered. And so now how are we going to actually hide it? Using some new open prop. That's exactly what we need. We need some piece of state that we can use to control this ourselves. So let's come up and use state. We'll create an open variable. We'll start to false. And now when we save, since open is false, our entire drop-down menu down here is not being rendered. So now we can see if we try to click, it doesn't show. And that's because open is always false. We're never calling set open. And so the final step here is to basically take full control of the menu and turn it from this kind of uncontrolled component that has its own state and wiring to a component that we fully control. You might have heard of controlled components before when talking about things like form inputs. This is the same idea here. Right now, the open state is internal to this because Radix wants the out-of-the-box experience to be easy. But we can take control of it if we need more flexibility like we do right here because we want to control this state ourselves. And so this root has a few props. We can see it has open and onOpen change. And if we pass these in, we basically turn this entire drop-down system into a controlled component. So let's pass in our open state to open. And onOpen change, we'll go ahead and pass set open. Just like that. And if we save this, look at that. How cool is that? So now we've got the mount animation running. And when we click out, we get onOpen change, which sets open to false. And because we have, again, the actual conditional here, this chunk has to be removed from the DOM for animate presence to do its thing. And before, these were always being rendered and they were doing some conditional rendering inside of their own render functions. But now that we've taken control, we've forced the mount of the portal and we have a controlled component right here, we get these really cool unmount animations from Framer Motion. And the other cool thing here is that we still get all the built-in features of the Radix menu, like arrow keys. And if I hit escape, look at that, it dismisses it, but it still runs our animation. If I hit enter, we see that we run our click handler, but again, our animations still work. If I hit item 3, we can see it runs an alert to the console. Again, this is just coming from our normal onSelect handlers right here. So this is already a cool example of how we can layer in animation while still having all the features from Radix. Okay, next we want to work on the actual click animations for these items. So right now we click them and they just kind of run their handler and the menu disappears. But again, in Mac, if we click about this Mac, we have this nice satisfying animation to let the user know, yep, you clicked this menu and now we're on the next step. So if we come down and take a look at our items, we see we're rendering this drop-down menu item from Radix, which runs the onSelect we pass in. And so the first step here is going to be to make a function so we have a little bit more control over this. Because if we just run this onSelect, Radix is going to do the default behavior of dismissing the menu. So in order to prevent that from happening, we can actually call e.preventDefault in our onSelect prop from Radix. And so if we do this, we see that the menu doesn't get closed. We're still running our select right here. That's what we pass in. But if we just prevent default, nothing happens to the actual menu, which is going to give us a chance to animate these. So next, we actually want to do the same thing we did above and go ahead and drop an asChild right here so that we can wrap this in a div. This will be emotion.div. And again, this is going to give us a chance to animate these. It goes ahead and forwards all these props and the behavior to this div right here. So if we were to bring this back, everything should still work just fine. Now we should actually be able to use the initial and animate props just like we did on our menu. So let's just test this out with a little mount animation and make sure these all work. We can see the menu items are sliding in right there. But we don't actually want to use initial, animate, and exit on these menu items, do we? Because it's not about their life cycle when they're mounted and unmounted from the DOM. It's actually about when we click them. And that's when we want to trigger an animation. And so because we want to trigger an animation as a result of an event happening, we actually want to drop down a level from this kind of more declarative API that Framer Motion gives us to a more imperative one, so that in the click handler, we can say, go ahead and run the blink animation. And for that, we're going to use an API from Framer Motion called use animation controls. So let's come over here and get rid of initial and animate. And I'm going to come right up to our component and use animation controls from Framer Motion. And this gives us a controls variable right here. And we can see it's type animation controls. And the way we use this is by passing this in to animate. And controls lets us basically do whatever we want. We can say controls.start. Let's just send the X over 100 pixels when we click on it. Right? Or we could send it over 100 and then bring it back to 0. Pretty funny, right? I mean, you can basically do whatever you want with this, but you get the idea that this is our way to imperatively run animations as a result of our select event. And so you can see where I'm going with this. Instead of animating X, let's go ahead and animate the background color. So if we just take a look at this again, when we highlight this, this is this kind of blue color. If we look down here, it's actually right here, data highlighted, background sky 400, and the text goes white. And if we take a look at the Mac menu, we'll see that we highlight this in blue and the text is white like that. And when I click, it just blinks. So basically the background goes to transparent. We'll see the original text color, and then we want it to be blue again. So first, let's just get the background color to kind of go transparent. And first, let's just start with white, just to see if we're on the right track. So if I come and click, nice, we see the background fades out to white, and let's go ahead and make the color black. We'll tweak these colors soon, but for now we'll just keep it simple. So let's click this. Okay, cool, so that goes away. And it's a little slow, so let's go ahead and say transition, duration, well, let's start with 0.5, something like that. Or maybe 0.25. Okay, so that's kind of our first blink. Let's go ahead and bring it back to the highlighted color. The sky 400 is this hex code. And for the text color, let's make that white. So let's see how this looks. Seems like nothing's happening right here. And the problem is that we're running both of these immediately, and so we're not seeing the animation. Well, the cool thing about controls.start, if we hover over this, we'll see it returns a promise, which means we can await it to orchestrate different parts of our animation. That's exactly what we want to do here. We want to await the first part and then await the second part. So let's turn this onSelect into an async function. We'll go ahead and await the first blink, and then we'll await the second one. And if we save this, look at that. That's pretty cool. Let's come back and bring these down to 0.1. Check this out again. And that's getting pretty close. Okay, so now that we have our blink, the last step is for us to actually close the menu. And again, because we call prevent default, we've stopped Radix from doing that for us automatically so that we can have a chance to run our animation. And so now we actually have to close it ourselves. So let's come up to the top. Fortunately, we're controlling this with our own state, so we can write a little close menu function right up here that calls set open to false. And let's just pass this directly in to our items. Close menu, is closeMenu. We'll go ahead and expose that. That'll be required. closeMenu is a function. And now we can call closeMenu right here after our animation has run. And it looks like it can be undefined here. We don't need to worry about that. So let's remove that. It's always passed in. And now let's give this a shot. Okay, check that out. Show the menu, blink the item here, and then we dismiss the menu. And this seems to be working pretty well. Except if we come down here and press item 3, we'll notice something interesting. We ran our item 3's kind of event handler, which is right here on select. We just want to alert a little winky face right here. And we ran that before our menu animated out. So if we look at the other two items that just call set state, we can see that feels pretty good. We can work on the transitions and the animation here to tighten it up a little bit. But conceptually, it does seem like the orchestration is working pretty well. But right here, it's very clear that we haven't waited for the menu to finish animating out before running the provided select handler. And you can imagine how that could cause some issues. And again, if we look at Mac OS, it's very tight where if I click this, we kind of get the selection, we get the menu fade out, and then we get the dialog to fade in. So how might we recreate that here? Well, we already have an async function. We're awaiting the blink so that that happens first, but then we're just running closeMenu and immediately running onSelect. So if closeMenu was async, then we could actually also await it right here. And that would give the menu time to close before we run our onSelect. So how might we make this closeMenu function an async function that actually waits until the menu has finished running its unmount animation? Well, if we take a look right now at our code, we're going to see this is the exit animation right now. And again, it's using this kind of declarative API from Framer Motion, both for the initial mount animation and the exit unmount animation. But now we want to have a function that we can use to await a step. Again, we want to drop down to use animation controls. So let's go ahead and use animation controls up here in the app as well. This gives us some controls. And if we come down to motion.div, we can pass these controls in just like this. So now this div is being controlled by these controls, which means if we were to kind of refresh and click the menu, nothing's happening because we now need to tell it to fade in from the initial value once open becomes true. So where should we actually run this animation after the user clicks on the menu? Your first guess might be, okay, anytime onOpenChange runs, let's go ahead and set open just like this. But then we can also say controls.start and then set the opacity. Let's just set it to 1 for now and see if this works. So anytime open changes, this is when we'll kick off our animation. But if we refresh and try this, it won't actually work. We can see we just clicked an invisible menu item here. And this is because we're setting open and trying to run this animation kind of all in the same render. And the way these animations work is that the element needs to be mounted first before the animations are run. So let's go ahead and undo this. Instead, we'll let kind of Radix control the open state as it changes with these. And we'll just add an effect up here that we can use to respond to changes in open. So to start, let's say if open is true, well, then we need to go ahead and start our mount animation right here and set the opacity to 1. And we'll go ahead and autofill these dependencies just like that. And check that out. We've got our mount animation back. And actually we have our unmount animation as well. So this is kind of neat. We still get to use the declarative API on this motion.div for the initial and exit stages of our menu. But now we have some imperative controls we can use. We've got back our open state, but this still works. You know, if we click, if we hit escape and dismiss it, all these still work. And this is going to give us the power to make this function async. So let's make this function an async function. And when we close the menu, let's go ahead and controls.start, opacity 0. And again, this returns a promise, so we can await it. And with any luck, let's see what happens when we select an item. Okay, looks like we're in business. Item 2, and this is the final test. Item 3. So that's pretty cool. We awaited the menu closing until we ran the alert. And it just feels a lot tighter and cleaner with regards to the overall orchestration. You can imagine these things doing all sorts of behavior in your application when you select. Maybe you're navigating somewhere, maybe you're showing another dialogue or a modal or anything you want to do. It'd be nice to have the confidence, if you were to make this kind of a reusable thing that you would start using throughout your app, that other developers or yourself could use this and know the menu has dismissed before you run that select handler. So I thought this was a pretty cool way to see how you can use these controls to pull off some orchestration here. And you can just drop down a level, make these ourselves so that we can really fully control what's happening. But we still get to use these. We still want to keep these exit and initial, because if I go ahead and hit escape, we're actually still using that unmount animation right there. We're not using our close menu function at all. So this kind of has all of our bases covered, and I'm pretty happy with the orchestration. Let's go ahead and tighten up the actual animation and the code before we wrap up. So the first thing I'm going to do here is, you'll notice we have some details about our animation, like what it's actually doing right here, here, and right here and here. For this, we can refactor these to variants so that they're all defined in the same place. So let's define a variance key with open, and this is just opacity is 1, and closed is opacity is 0. And now we can replace exit here with just a string, actually. Closed, initial is closed. And controls can also take a variant name right here, which is pretty cool. So when we close this, we can actually just put closed in like that. And to open it in the effect, we can say this is open. So if we refresh, looks like everything's still working. But now we have all the details of our animation code in one place. So next we can tweak the easing and duration of this with transition. So for open, I want ease out, and I want the duration to be 0.1. And for closed, let's make ease in, and we'll also say duration is 0.1. So that should feel a little bit nicer here. Maybe the duration on going out is 0.2, because I think it takes a little bit longer on Mac. Yeah, that looks pretty nice. Something like that. Cool, so that's our menu. And finally, let's come down to our item here. Let's take a look at this. Feels a little sluggish. Let's change these durations to 0.04. And lastly, it just kind of disappears a little fast. I think it holds for just a second, kind of after you click it, just to give that confirmation. So let's actually just pause right here. I kind of want to just await a sleep to pause before we go ahead and close the menu. So I'm just going to drop in a function here that takes in a number and returns a promise. And I'm going to use 0.075 for that. So let's see how this feels. Yeah, that feels really good. I like how the user is kind of looking at the item when you're clicking on it, and you get a chance to know I clicked the right item before looking to see what happens elsewhere in the app. And I have actually started noticing, since I built this demo, there's a lot of lists that you click and then you start navigating a page, the menu disappears instantly, and the page navigation actually takes some time. So as a user, sometimes there's some confusion or ambiguity over whether I actually clicked the right menu item or not. And so even though this is kind of from OS and this is not the normal kind of menu item interaction we see on the web, I think especially for certain applications, web applications, adding some behavior like this, some animation, makes a really big difference, and it just gives the user the confidence that, hey, I actually clicked item 2, and the reason nothing's happening is because of some other thing, but it's not like I have to go back and click item 2 again. So I thought this was a great example. You know, Apple is really good at this, making sure user interfaces are always responsive to user input. The user is never left wondering if it received input from them or not. And Apple really exemplifies this very well. And I thought this was a cool little example of how to pull this off with Radix and Framer Motion. So I'm glad somebody, this actually came from a question. Someone asked me how to animate a Radix component with Framer Motion. I had never used it before. And so I'm glad they asked me that, because I'm really happy with how this turned out. There was quite a few steps in what we did, but we kind of got down to the lowest levels, the medium low levels of both the libraries, which kind of gave us total control. And I think as a next video, it might be fun for me to basically show you how I would think about using this throughout an application, because you wouldn't want, obviously, everyone who needs to render a menu anywhere in an app you're working on to have to copy all of this code. But I love the flexibility that this code provides. And so there's a lot of things that I would do to basically extract this into a more reusable component and thread all of this stuff through it implicitly, so that developers who are working with it, they can just basically render something very close, maybe even a little bit higher level to what we saw in the beginning, which is just a drop-down menu with some items that have an onSelect callback. So if that sounds interesting to you, let me know in the comments. But otherwise, ask any more questions. I love making videos from questions that folks ask. And if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.